it's now my pleasure to introduce our first keynote guest speaker today. And hopefully if the technology is working, and I'm just going to get a wee thumbs up from the back of the room, we're going live to Liverpool. Hi, Rhodri.
Hi there.
How you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Yeah. Excellent. You can hear me. That's fantastic. We can hear you. We can see you. By the way, just to let you know, your head is about 8 foot tall on this screen, just so you know. So looking good though, by the way, and well-trimmed beards, which is excellent to see. Thank you for joining us, Rhodri. And I think whoever wrote this introduction was trying to break me, because philanthropy is not the easiest word to say, and it's mentioned about 9 times in this introduction. So I'm going to try and paraphrase a little bit, but Rhodri is a well-known commentator and expert on philanthropy and also civil society. He's the founder and director of the think tank Why Philanthropy Matters, and also hosts a podcast called Philanthropisms. He is a research fellow in the Centre of Philanthropy for the University of Kent. He's also the author of 2 books, What is Philanthropy For? And Public Good for Private Means, How Philanthropy Shapes Britain. He was formerly head of policy at Charities Aid Foundation, where he's also set up the in-house think tank Giving Thought. So Rhodri is going to talk to us about technology and the opportunity that it has on the third sector. So Rhodri, delighted to hand over to you. Give him a big round of applause.
Great, well, thank you very much. And I should say, firstly, I feel like I do this too often these days, but I should apologise for not being there in person with all of you. I'd love to have been able to, but I'm sandwiching this between a couple of other events. I guess one of the immediate sort of positive impacts of technology on the charity sector is that I am at least able to be there virtually instead. So that's a relief to me. I guess I'll just very briefly give a slight bit of further backstory on my involvement around issues to do with technology and civil society, just to kind of set the scene. As was said in the intro there, I used to work at Charities Aid Foundation, where I was head of policy, and I also set up an in-house think tank called Giving Thought. And what we try to do through a lot of that work, and what I try to do through my work today, is to try and step back a little bit and look at things a bit bigger picture when it comes to philanthropy in the charity sector, and think about the wider context, both where it's come from, where it sits now in the wider world, and where it might be going in the future. And I think technology is such an important part of that, because it is such a huge shaping force in society today. And I often worry that the philanthropy and charity world is in danger of getting a bit left behind in some of that thinking, which is going to present new challenges, but also means there's the risk of missing out on potentially huge opportunities, which is some of what I want to talk to you about today. So the title of this session is Exploring Technology's Potential for Impact on the Third Sector. And just to outline what I want to do. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the key challenges that are facing the charity sector right now, just to set the scene a bit. I then want to explore what the impact of technology in particular might be with respect to some of those challenges, both the positive side, I think, in terms of how tech could help us overcome some of them, and also some of the things I think we need to be wary of in terms of tech's potential to exacerbate some of these challenges as well. I want to look briefly at the current state of tech and digital adoption in the charity sector to get a feel for what that is and what some of the barriers might be that are holding things back a bit there. And then I want to talk a bit about why partnerships between the tech sector and the charity sector are so important as a potential way of overcoming those barriers, and what benefits that can bring to both sides, both to the charities themselves and to tech companies. And then hopefully I want to leave you feeling suitably inspired and invigorated for the rest of the day, with a sense that there might be some pretty big challenges out there right now, and we need to be realistic about that, but also that we do have the potential to play a real part in addressing them. So first, I just want to say a bit about the challenges facing the charity sector. And I should warn you, this is probably the bit that comes across as a little bit bleak and depressing up front. So I'll try and sort of get through it. But I think we have to be realistic about the fact there are some really significant challenges for charities right now, and there isn't really any point pretending otherwise. The big backdrop, obviously, is the economic situation we find ourselves in. Obviously, we're just coming off the back of the global pandemic. That presented huge challenges for charities in terms of finding that their incomes, for many of them, were falling because their traditional ways of fundraising often kind of fell off a cliff if they were used to doing in-person events or running shops or businesses that weren't able to trade anymore. But then at the same time, unlike many private sector companies, they weren't seeing a drop-off in demand. They were actually seeing a huge rise in demand, and so they were finding themselves squeezed between these two things. I think we've come out of hopefully the other side of the pandemic, and we might have hoped for a brief bit of relief, but we've gone straight into a cost of living crisis, and that's presenting even more significant challenges for many charities. So there's many factors to this. There's rising inflation, obviously, and that has a twofold impact on charities, really, because they find that the value of their own reserves or the cash they hold is reduced and their purchasing power is reduced as a result. But at the same time, the staff that work in those charities are also going to be feeling the pinch. So there may be pressure to increase wages, and charities that are already themselves struggling might find it very difficult to do that. I think there are obviously particular issues around energy costs, and they are, I think, a real challenge for many charities, smaller ones in particular, that often are very reliant on a particular building or set of community buildings, many of which are highly energy inefficient, but also which see huge demand, particularly in the colder months, as people look to them when they can't afford to heat their own homes. At the same time, we've got rising interest rates, which, obviously on the one hand means that you might be getting more of a return on savings that are held, but also it becomes more expensive to service debt, and property becomes more expensive. And obviously lots of charities do hold property. And then at the same time, as we saw during the pandemic, we're seeing an increasing rise in demand for charity services as people and communities around the country feel the pinch themselves. So in a relatively recent pro bono economics and law family commission survey, 55% of charities that they asked said demand for their services had gone up. And I think it's important to say that's the obvious ones that you would expect. So it's food banks, which are very visible. It's poverty advice services and things like that are dealing with the direct impacts of the cost of living crisis. But it's also some of the less obvious ones. So it's things like mental health services, because there tends to be large spikes in mental health issues around loneliness and isolation when it comes to people feeling economic impacts. Also things like domestic violence, which unfortunately tends to go up when people are struggling with issues of poverty, and even things like animal welfare. Lots of charities that deal with that have said they've been inundated as people are no longer able to look after pets that they may have owned before or have bought recently, and they're having to kind of bring these into shelters. So I think these effects are felt in all sorts of different ways. The second challenge that's facing the charity sector, which unfortunately makes things harder still, is that there's a significant concern, I think, within the sector that may be in the midst of a long-term decline when it comes to giving and volunteering. Now, levels of charitable giving have historically been pretty resilient in the face of economic downturns. But since 2008 and the financial crash there's a sort of suspicion that things might be qualitatively different this time. And that's partly because we seem to be in the midst of a sort of longer term decline in levels of participation in giving. This has been masked slightly by an increase in the value of average donations, so that the headline amounts have remained broadly similar. But what we're seeing is that the charity sector is as a result, becoming more reliant on a smaller number of higher value donations. So the kind of pool of donors is potentially shrinking. And that's really important, because giving by the public has become ever more important to the charity sector. And there's been a really marked shift over the last 20 years, for instance. This year just gone, 2021, 2022, it was the first year since at least the year 2000 that giving by the public was the main source of income for charities. According to the most recent NCVO almanac, it's now 51% of all income to the sector. And that's doubled since 2000. So it's gone up from 15 billion to 30 billion. And in terms of percentages, it's risen from 42% of sector income to 51%. So the sector as a whole really is reliant on charitable giving from the public. And that's particularly true for smaller organisations who, as a rule, tend to get an even larger proportion of their income from those voluntary sources. And I think the cost of living crisis is potentially making that even more challenging. So that's come on the back of the pandemic, as I've said, and it's led to the potential for further reductions in giving. So we don't know the effects of those yet, but surveys that have been out there and research that's been done suggests that there is cause for concern. So another pro bono economic survey said that 26% of people they spoke to said they were already giving less to charity as a result of the cost of living crisis. And a survey for Britain Thinks found that 34% of people said that either they were cancelling or reducing charitable donations or were definitely going to do so. So in that context, there's cause for concern, but makes the point that fundraising is really, really crucial. And that's certainly an area we'll come on to, where technology and the ability to kind of use digital tools effectively is hugely important. It's also worth saying that it's not just money. There are also indications that volunteering may be down, especially among groups that were traditionally hugely important within the volunteer workforce, older people and people with disabilities. So I think always round, the challenges that the resources that the charity sector has to draw on might be diminishing. I think for the people working in charities as well, there are challenges too. A big one that I hear a lot about at the moment is burnout and workforce attrition. So 76% of people in a recent survey, again from Pro Bono Economics, said that the managers in charities were concerned about well-being, stress and burnout in their own organizations. And actually 28% of them said they were very concerned. So it's a real thing that's very front of mind for lots of people in the sector. And I certainly know, as I'm sure lots of people do from personal experience and anecdotal evidence, that there are lots of people who are either looking to move into other sectors for work or just to take a break from work altogether because of that sense of burnout that they're feeling. And I think it's difficult for charities to address that, even if they're concerned about it, when they're finding themselves squeezed between rising demand and the economic situation that they themselves as organizations are in. It's possible that there are some solutions to be found in the potential for new working practices. So changes to things like working from home, remote working, 4-day weeks might offer some ways of addressing some of these issues. And to many, it might seem obvious that charities should be at the forefront of adopting these kinds of flexible practices. But actually at a sectoral level, I think we're potentially lagging behind the public and the private sector. And that may be in part a technology issue, as we'll come on to. I think another one of the challenges that we've seen facing the charity sector at the moment is around resilience. The pandemic was a real shock to society as a whole. And one of the things it showed to the charity sector was the importance of resilience and being resilient, both at the level of individual organizations and also at the level of the whole sector. Now, what it actually means to be resilient, I think, is not always clear. I think there are lots of elements to it. Some of it's about having your finances in order, but some of it's also about having digital capabilities and having access to the right infrastructure, because it's really clear to most people now that that's a critical part of what it means to be resilient, looking ahead to the future. And that's important because, unfortunately, without wanting to be the harbinger of doom, I think the pandemic's unlikely to be the only major crisis we all face in our lifetimes. In fact, a lot of experts increasingly are talking about an ongoing polycrisis that has multiple different factors around climate concerns and inequality and other things, including pandemics coming down the road. And so I think for charities, being prepared for that and ensuring that they have the resilience to deal with further crises is going to be hugely important. I think another factor that is not necessarily a direct challenge in the same way, but is something that's very important for charities to be aware of, is that the context within which they operate is shifting rapidly. I often think of this as a kind of widening landscape for doing good. So there might have been a sense once that charities were the only game in town when it came to doing social good and to kind of achieving positive change in society. But I definitely don't think that's the case anymore, if in fact it ever really was. These days, there's a really growing range of options for people when it comes to wanting to do good in the world. And I think technology is playing a big part in making that happen. So, at one end of the spectrum, you've got things like ethical consumerism, the ability to sort of shop ethically and to choose businesses on the basis of your ethical principles. We've got businesses that are putting purpose at the forefront of what they're doing. We've got models like social investment and impact investing that are trying to blend the desire for financial and social benefit. And then at another end of the spectrum, we've got things like mutual aid networks, many of which sort of sprung up during the pandemic, that are kind of loosely tied together networks of people trying to kind of provide things to each other on the basis of solidarity. We've also got digital social movements like Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter that are doing things that have been done before in terms of having kind of grassroots movements, but at a scale and a pace that we've never really seen before. And then we've also got people returning to very old models of giving, sort of direct person-to-person giving, but again, doing that at a national or even a global scale, because the use of platform technology allows you to do that in a way that previously was probably limited by geography. Is this actually a problem? I don't know. If the overall amount of good in the world is the same, or in fact even more, does it matter if charities have a smaller share of that pie? Perhaps not. But it does raise questions about what, if anything, the unique value of charities and charity as a model is. I think there is some value to it, but I think there's a big challenge in terms of being clear about what that USP is and not just assuming that we all know. I think just in terms of the final two challenges, one is the political landscape for charities, I think is increasingly challenging. In a practical sense, I think charities have a real challenge in terms of just having a seat at the table when it comes to engaging with government. I think at times in the past they've had more of a voice, and at the moment they really are quite marginalised, even when there are debates about policy areas in which those charities have very relevant expertise. I think one of the challenges that goes along with that is there is a climate in which the legitimacy of charities campaigning and advocating on the issues that they work on is being brought into question continually. And I think that ties into a wider global phenomenon, which is the space within which civil society as a whole operates is shrinking in lots of places, because lots of the freedoms on which those organizations rely, the freedom of association, freedom of speech, the right to protest, are all being eroded. I think, unfortunately, we are seeing that happen to an extent in this country, but it's happening to a much greater extent in many other places of the world. And at the same time, lots of the issues that do concern us as a society are increasingly becoming politicized and polarized, and people are kind of applying culture war narratives to issues that are important to all of us, many of which charities work on, but which then get kind of dragged into the realm of politics and become more difficult to talk about reasonably. And then in terms of the final set of challenges, that'll bring us on to talking about technology. I think there are some challenges that are being presented by technology itself before we get to the opportunities. I think one is just access to that technology and ability to use it, not necessarily for charities themselves at this point, but for the people and communities they work with. I think there are real issues around digital access and exclusion and a kind of digital divide that might open up in society between those who are able to use technology to access services and rights and those who aren't. I think there are issues around cybersecurity when you do actually try to use technology. And one of the challenges for charities, I think, is increasingly a sense that they might be seen as a soft target when it comes to cyber attacks. And also that is linked to some of what we've said already about the changes in working patterns, because the more that organizations shift to things like remote working, but do so very quickly without having really kind of engaged with some of the issues, I think that brings challenges. And then I think there are impacts around more emergent technology, such as new modes of automation through artificial intelligence, which will have a huge impact on the way charities operate, but also on the people and communities that they work with, of which we'll say more in a bit. So that brings us on to the kind of meat of what I want to talk about, which is the impact of tech on the charity sector. I touched there on a couple of the challenges that tech development might pose for charities, but I want to focus in now on that question of what is technology's potential for impact on the third sector. And I think it's useful, or certainly I find it useful, to kind of unpack that in three different ways, just to help frame the way we think about this. So the first way in which I think technology can have an impact on the charity sector that's important is the direct use of technology to achieve social or environmental missions in new and innovative ways, or just making existing interventions more efficient or effective. I think that's often how we think of tech for good. The idea that we have is charities or civil society organizations partnering with tech firms to come up with fascinating new ways of addressing kind of long-standing challenges, and they're often really kind of inspiring and interesting. There's lots of great examples as well, and they range from relatively straightforward applications of established technology through to really cutting edge applications of emerging tech. You'll hear loads and loads of examples today, so I won't labor this point, but just a couple that I've come across recently that I thought were really interesting. One in an international context was a project that the Vodafone Foundation was involved in Tanzania called the M-Mama program. And that was using a new, it was an app-based solution around a problem to do with maternal health and access to transport for women who were in pregnancy or actually kind of at the point of delivering children. But the ambulance network is very sporadic and unreliable. And so instead they created an app-based network that allowed taxi drivers and also just other members of the public who'd signed up to offer to drive women to healthcare facilities when they needed that. And that seemed to be kind of hugely effective. And the figures on the impact of that are really impressive. And then another one, kind of more at the using the cutting edge technology end of the spectrum, is an organization called Be My Eyes, which already had an existing kind of free app-based service that connected people with visual impairments with volunteers who are sighted and were able to kind of read documents for them or kind of give descriptions of things. And they've just launched a virtual version of that called Virtual Volunteer. And that's a new app which combines image recognition technology and a GPT-4 based conversational interface. And that allows users then to get information about their surroundings on an automated basis just by pointing their phone around and then getting descriptions and being able to ask questions and have them answered, which I think is absolutely fascinating. I think the thing to say about this is, although this kind of tech for good often is deeply inspirational and really fascinating, is there a risk that it becomes a bit self-selecting or exclusionary in the context of the wider charity sector, where we're often talking about quite a small segment of that sector that kind of gets it or is able to get it? And then there's potentially a really long tail of charities for whom this kind of thing seems totally out of reach. And we'll look in a moment at what some of the barriers might be to that and how they might be overcome. I think the second impact of technology on charities, which is really important, and I find when I'm talking to charities about this whole question of technology, some of them are skeptical about that first idea of tech for good because they think it's interesting, but as I say, they think it's very much not for them. And for those organizations often say, well, even if you at the moment don't think you are going to harness tech directly yourselves in your products and services and interventions, actually, the reality is that tech development's happening all around you and very fast. And so it's going to change the environment within which you're working. And the danger is that if you don't at least understand what's going on and try and adapt, you'll get overtaken by that. And technology will become something that happens to you rather than something that you have any ability to shape or control. And I think what I think we're talking about here more in a way is the sort of stuff that might seem less glamorous in a sense. So it's the impact of technology on the back office of charities, back office processes, or the infrastructure that charities use, whether that's kind of financial or regulatory. And even though it's unglamorous, though, I think actually in many ways that's likely to have a far larger impact in the short term on a larger part of the charity sector than some of the kind of direct tech for good projects are. I think there's all sorts of possibilities there. There's lots of things like robotic process automation, just taking kind of repetitive data-intensive tasks and using automation to mean that human beings don't have to do those anymore. I think, there are obviously, we've highlighted one example before of using something like GPT-4, and there's lots of new opportunities just emerging at the moment, or pretty much every week, to use automation in knowledge-based functions as well. I think there are also potentially some really significant impacts on fundraising and giving. So there's the opportunity to use technology to open up new potential donor pools and donor markets through things like the gaming community, which has proven itself to be quite engaged in fundraising and giving, but perhaps not in traditional ways. I think there's really interesting questions about the role of platforms and what that means in terms of shaping the ways in which people give. I think one of the things I've noticed is there's a real shift from people using charity-specific platforms, Just Giving and BT My Donate and Virgin Giving when those existed, through to people increasingly using commercial payment or social media platforms to make donations to organizations or even to individuals, and things like Venmo and Cash App and those kinds of tools. And then I think there are also going to be new opportunities for donor experiences of various kinds. I've been kind of keeping an eye over the last few months on the emergence of metaverse fundraising, which is very kind of early stage and emergent, and I think people are just sort of testing the waters. But there've been a few interesting examples of that happening, and that potentially again opens up new tools for fundraisers to use. And then the final way that I think tech will have an impact on the people and communities that charities serve. And this is the one I deploy when I meet some skepticism still about 1 and 2 that I've outlined there, and organizations who perhaps feel that they're not going to use technology themselves and they don't think it's going to have a huge impact on them as organizations. I think the point then is, even if you're not concerned about the impact of tech on your own organization, the reality is it is probably having an impact on the lives of the people and communities that you as an organization serve. So again, if you don't at least understand what's going on, the risk is that you'll find in a few years' time that you're failing to meet the needs of those people or communities, or even worse, you've become totally irrelevant to them. Now, some of those impacts I'm talking about there might be actually positive, relatively neutral. Technology might be changing people's expectations about how they want to access information, for instance, and you just need to adapt to that. Or it might be that they're using new channels for communication, and you just need to be aware of that. And it potentially, again, that's an opportunity. But I think there are also negative impacts that we're increasingly aware of in terms of technology, which charities need to adapt to, or maybe even make active efforts to address. We mentioned the fact that access to technology can itself become a new form of inequality if we're not careful. I think there are issues that are increasingly, people are aware of around the dangers of bias when it comes to automation and the use of algorithmic systems. I think there's a whole set of issues around polarization and the economics based on attention within the online environment, and what that means for the provision of information, and what it means for our ability to kind of talk about complex or nuanced subjects. And I think there are, a whole related set of issues around misinformation and the erosion of trust, which will affect charities quite significantly, because trust, I think, is such an important part of the currency that they have. So I think, having outlined those three different ways, I just want to say something about what the current state of adoption in the tech sector is. Hopefully we're all sold at this point on the idea that technology is relevant and important for the charity sector. So given that, is adoption commonplace, and are all organizations making it a key part of their strategic thinking at a board and management level? No, not really. There's still, I think, unfortunately, a pretty big gap between awareness of the importance of tech, which I think is relatively high these days in the charity sector, and actually responding accordingly. So the 2022 Charity Trends Report from CAF, for instance, found 89% of charity leaders said that they believe technological change is relevant to their organization. But then the most recent Charity Digital Skills Report found that 43% of the organizations surveyed characterized themselves as at best starting out when it comes to tech, and didn't have a specific strategy in place yet. As I said, the picture is definitely improving from where it was a few years ago. And the proportion of organizations that are taking steps to invest in technology and develop a strategic approach has gone up, but there's still a long way to go. And that brings us, I guess, to what some of the barriers might be that kind of hold back tech adoption in the charity sector, which will, I think, then set the stage for talking about the potential for partnership. So one of the most obvious barriers is kind of lack of knowledge and skills when it comes to technology. And that is the most obvious version, is obviously just kind of lack of knowledge and skills around technology within the staff of an organization. But I think it's also important at a leadership and at a trustee level, if not more important, because that's where I think the strategic thinking needs to take place, rather than necessarily just the kind of direct implementation. And again, that can be, it's not just lack of knowledge about what's happening at the cutting edge of virtual reality or AI or anything like that. It can be pretty basic lack of knowledge about how to use existing technology, like email, communications tools like that, social media, cloud computing, and these sorts of things. I think there is also lack of knowledge about wider technology trends, or in some cases, not even a lack of knowledge, but a lack of ability to see how things that people might be aware of more broadly being talked about in society are relevant to their organization and to their work. There's often a lot of work to be done just kind of translating that into why it is relevant to the context of charities. And I think for me, one of the key challenges there is how to enable charities to understand developments in technology and what's going on through the lens of their own expertise and experience. And I think, and certainly in my experience, one of the things I found is a key part of doing that is to get away from talking about the technicalities of specific technologies, which is very tempting for technologists to do because they love this stuff, but instead try to focus on the affordances of the technology. So what it actually enables you to do, what kind of incentives it creates, what kind of abilities it offers you. And then I think it's easier to understand what the relevant impacts might be for a charity, because they can think of that in terms of the challenges they face or the work that they already do. I think we are seeing that happen to a certain extent at the moment, actually, with all the wider public debate about ChatGPT, because I think there's lots of conversations about what's going to happen to education and to all sorts of other aspects of society. And I think that's giving something of a template for people in the charity sector, perhaps to sort of think, oh, that's maybe how we need to think about some of these technology issues. But I think to do that systematically requires infrastructure and support to make sure that that knowledge transfer happens in the right ways. And unfortunately, that needs funding, which will bring us on to one of our other challenges in a second. I think the other thing to say is there's a capacity issue as well. It's not just capabilities. There's lots of organizations in the charity sector, especially smaller ones, who are incredibly stretched, as we've seen. And they would love to spend more time thinking about and talking about and exploring technology, but they just don't have the time to do that when they're struggling to keep the lights on. And particularly if technology is seen as something that's kind of a nice to have rather than an essential part of their overall strategy, it just, gets pushed onto the back burner all the time. I think another issue for many organizations is the way in which technology is still perceived. I think it's still seen as something that's the responsibility of the IT department rather than a key strategic variable that cuts across the whole of an organization's activities. But I think increasingly it's apparent that tech needs to be part of the responsibility of the senior leadership team and the trustees, which obviously then kind of puts more emphasis back on the skills gap issue that we talked about a moment ago. I think there's also a risk angle to this, which is one of the challenges is that there's a perceived risk of investing in technology or getting too involved in technology. And there's a lack of risk appetite among charities and among their trustees. I think the concern is understandable. What if we back the wrong horse into using the wrong kind of product or platform or kind of spend too much money on these things and we don't really understand what we're doing? So I think when we're talking about investing in a charity's own capacity, I think that's a challenge in terms of presenting it to donors and funders as well, because one of the things, even if charities want to invest in their own digital capacity, that's often seen as something that is secondary to their core function or their frontline function, and it's often perceived as an overhead. So justifying that spending is another challenge for them. I think one of the other things that's linked to that is that finding money that's available to do that kind of investment is an ongoing challenge. So in the Charity Digital Skills Survey, for instance, 45% of charities said they hadn't been able to access grant funding for digital over the year in which they'd been surveyed. So they can't necessarily find specific funding to invest in their own digital capabilities. The challenge then is, do you have to factor that into your wider core cost funding? And obviously that then means that you either have to increase the amounts you're asking for, or you have to kind of factor that in, and that reduces amounts of money available for other things. And I think the other thing is, if you're looking for funding to invest in digital capabilities, you might be able to get one-off funding for tech development. But what then happens in terms of the year-on-year funding that you need to keep that going and to make sure that it's up to date, and finding that sort of funding is perhaps even more difficult. I think another challenge for the sector as a whole is a lack of infrastructure. I think places where charities can go to find knowledge and advice and practical support on digital are limited. I think there are charity sector infrastructure bodies that are increasingly trying to do some of this. And obviously, there are organizations like Scottish Tech Army that are trying to do, particular bits of that in terms of connecting the tech sector to the charity sector. But the overall ecosystem that's required to get the charity sector really up to speed with technology has many more gaps, I think, that need filling. And also they need funding. And that presents another challenge, because anyone who works in an infrastructure body will know that making the case for funding infrastructure is continually a challenge. I think another issue that presents a barrier for some organizations in the charity sector, or I'd say probably most organizations, is around data. I think the starting point with many possible tech applications or getting involved in tech projects is understanding and being able to use your own data. But the current state of skills, knowledge, and practices around data in the charity sector is not great. I think there are some pockets of really good best practice and some really kind of encouraging things happen. But I think overall, when you look at the data picture within the charity sector, there's not as much of it as you would hope. And where there is, it's patchy or it needs an enormous amount of work in order to be kind of usable. I think in terms of what happens going forward as well, there are all sorts of questions about data collection practices, what data to collect, how to do that, how to store it, and then concerns about the security of that and meeting requirements around things like GDPR and any other potential regulations that come down the road. And I think the final barrier as well, which is an interesting one that's grown over the last few years, is around the ethical dimension of technology. I think charities are increasingly aware that there are ethical concerns about some aspects of the technology industry. And I think that includes things like just the simple fact that there are, the amount of power in the hands of a very small number of actors is potentially a problem in its own right. I think some of those organizations are involved in working with kind of regimes around the world or involved in aspects of different sectors that the charities might themselves be uncomfortable with. I think there are issues around how some of those tech companies have collected and used data that obviously are causing quite a lot of controversy more widely. I think also everybody is kind of aware there are pretty acute ongoing issues with the failure to combat known problems around misinformation and online harms, and also the wider impacts that technology is increasingly having on things like mental health and well-being. And I think that makes some charities nervous about engaging with the tech sector in the same way as they might be nervous about engaging with the fossil fuel industry or the gambling sector. In the Charity Digital Skills Survey, 55% of charities surveyed said they were looking into applying ethical criteria to their choice of technology suppliers, and that was up from 35% just the year before. So that's really something that we are seeing change quite significantly. And that's a whole load of potential barriers. So let's get onto the positive bit now, which is, in a lot of those barriers, one of the challenges is there often seems to be a kind of underlying assumption that charities need to do all of this on their own, and that's why it's virtually impossible. But of course they don't, and they probably can't. In actual fact, I think it's really clear what it needs is much deeper and better thought out partnerships between technology companies and their employees and charities. And the good news is that's really achievable, and it also can bring benefits for both sides of that partnership. So in terms of what those benefits are, I mean, the obvious benefits for charities of partnering with the tech sector is they get potentially free help with technology, and that's the most obvious benefit. They might get help with advice or even just access to existing tech products, or it might be longer term help with designing or creating new products specific to their circumstances. There's also the possibility, of funding, which is not to be mercenary, but charities do need funding. And it may be that in partnering with technology companies, they get direct funding from the companies that they're partnering with, or it might be more indirect. So it might be that they are able to leverage additional funding from other grant makers or from government as a result of their partnership and association with a particular technology company, because it gives them added credibility and legitimacy. I think another benefit, which goes back to something we highlighted in the challenges, is around increased resilience. So I think, as I said there, it's increasingly clear that digital and technology capabilities are an important element of charity resilience. So working with a tech sector partner in the right way can help boost an organization's overall resilience and make them more prepared, I think, for whatever the future brings. I think another benefit around the sort of wider than the specific application of technology might be that if you partner in a meaningful way with a technology company, you can develop as an organization your own knowledge and understanding of the sort of wider context of technology. That might be through direct knowledge transfer, where you're able to draw on the knowledge and expertise of people working in that partner tech company and have them sort of come in and do knowledge transfer activities and speak to your staff. Or it might just be indirectly through osmosis, because you're kind of moving in those circles and in that world. And as a result, you're just kind of more aware of what's going on. I think it also goes the other way as well. And that's a benefit for charities and for the tech sector, in that it can drive better understanding of charities in the tech sector and in kind of private sector more broadly. I think you shouldn't be naive and assume that individual charities are always brilliantly placed to give an overall picture of what's going on in their own sector, because they're often quite focused on what they themselves are doing or the specific cause area. So this might also involve additional support from sector infrastructure bodies who are able to give that bigger picture and to kind of know about or to comment on sector-wide trends. And then I guess another challenge, which goes to the last of the, another opportunity, sorry, that goes to the last of the challenges we talked about, is that if you do have ethical concerns around technology and the application of it or your use of it, your ability to do something about that and to influence it is going to be much greater if you're actually inside the tent. So if you as a charity have ethical concerns about technology, partnering with a tech company might offer opportunities to explore or highlight them in the particular context of that company, but it also might offer you opportunities to engage in wider advocacy about the issue as a whole at a kind of policy level, and to influence the tech sector and to influence government. And then in terms of the benefits for tech companies of partnering with charities, I very much think this flows the other way. I mean, the first is you might learn something. In fact, you almost certainly will. And that might be learning something about the context in which charities work, the charity sector as a whole, or the cause area of the organization that you're working in. But it also might be that you learn more about your own sector and your own skills by applying the technologies that you already know about in different contexts and to different challenges. And I've heard plenty of examples, and I know Ian mentioned in the intro earlier, of organizations that actually said, they've learned a lot more from the work that they've done partnering with charities than they do just on their kind of day-to-day business as usual application of technology. I think the other thing that's really important to acknowledge is the importance of a sense of purpose. So people in the tech sector and much more broadly beyond that are keen to ensure that their work gives them a sense of purpose, I think, as well as paying them just a salary. And I think for tech companies, partnerships are a great way of making that happen. It helps with recruitment, it can help with retention, it helps with staff well-being. And when there is that competition for talent, I think it's potentially a really powerful tool. And people, I think, are more likely to feel a sense of satisfaction if they feel that they're supporting charities in a way that genuinely makes use of their skills. So it is purposeful. And then I just want to say something briefly before I finish about a couple of the challenges I think we just need to be aware of in partnerships so that we're not painting an overly rosy picture or going into this with our eyes closed. One is that it doesn't happen by itself. Like so many things that are worth doing, it can be potentially quite difficult. It requires infrastructure to allow tech companies to find the right prospective charity partners and vice versa. And the partnerships themselves might require ongoing management, especially if they involve volunteer placements, because again, that can go wrong if it's not managed properly. I think there are issues around cultural mismatch if the organizations are not selected properly. It might just be practical challenges like people not really understanding the use of language that the other side has, or it might be kind of more fundamental misalignment of values and aims, and that can be really damaging. I think one of the challenges maybe is within the corporate world, where there is still a reliance on more traditional CSR or corporate volunteering approaches. I think that goes to this issue of not using skills properly. At one end of the spectrum, there's obviously the caricature of quite old-fashioned approaches to corporate volunteering. So, the picture is one of employees being taken off to paint a classroom somewhere that can then be used for kind of glossy pictures in the annual report. And there are plenty of apocryphal, possibly, stories of charities who have invited corporate volunteers of this kind in, and then they've immediately repainted the rooms that have just been painted. Or I've even heard of charities that apparently keep special walls for the sole purpose of allowing corporate teams to paint them so that they can do that without doing any harm. That's obviously something of a caricature, but there's definitely a kernel of truth in it. And I think this kind of corporate volunteering can still happen. And from the perspective of tech sector charity partnerships, I think there's also a modern version of that let's paint a wall problem, which is the creation of shiny new things, which are often apps that never end up getting used, and they end up becoming digital white elephants, which I guess goes to one of the other kind of fundamental challenges, which is the danger of solutionism and kind of tech solutionism. Now, that might, as I say, take the form of assuming that a particular technology is the solution to a problem you're presented with, just because that happens to be the technology that you know about, which is essentially the kind of high-tech equivalent of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But it also might be a slightly broader assumption that technology of any kind can be a solution in a total sense to problems that are, deeply entrenched and often quite complex. And then the final challenge that I'll raise just before leaving you with some closing thoughts is, I mentioned before that the risk of charity partnerships being used as a PR exercise, and that's something we should guard against, definitely. But in actual fact, I think that's a relatively naive and perhaps sort of slightly harmless example. I think the real concern for more charities these days when it comes to engaging with corporate partners, and I'm not singling out the tech sector here, I think it's just a wider issue, is the danger of being used as a prop in much more sophisticated sort of purpose washing efforts. So, we've heard a lot about greenwashing, where companies adopt the language and markers of environmental sustainability to mask the fact they're actually engaged in practices that are ecologically harmful. I think increasingly there's a concern that the wider language of social purpose and value can be co-opted by some organizations that aren't that well-intentioned to hide the fact that, again, they're not fundamentally changing what they do, but they're just kind of using these trappings to dress it up. And the risk for charities, obviously, is that if they're naive and going into these things without kind of proper due diligence, they can end up in partnerships that aren't aligned with their own best interests, and they may end up damaging their own reputations in doing so. So I've ended there with some potential problems, but I do just want to finally say this is not supposed to be a counsel of despair. The point, hopefully, that comes across is that, yes, there are a lot of challenges facing charities right now, and I think it's clear, not all of them by any means can be solved by the tech sector. However, finding ways to bring the tech sector and the charity sector together and form genuinely meaningful partnerships has huge potential to address some of these challenges. We just need to ensure that when we do that, we go into it with open eyes and honest about the challenges as well as the opportunities, which is why I think it's so great that organizations like the Scottish Tech Army are out there trying to make sure that links can be forged and partnerships can be created in a way that is meaningful and positive, and why it's great to have the opportunity for conversations like the one we're having here today, because that way we can assure that when the tech sector and the charity sector do come together, it's in ways that end up having the maximum impact, not just on the tech companies and on the charities, but on the people and communities that those charities and those tech companies fundamentally serve. And that, at the end of the day, surely is the real point. So thank you very much.